The young mistress whispered to the slave, "Give me a baby in 9 months, and you will never have to stay in the slave quarters again." The Louisiana summer of 1847 hung heavy with secrets darker than the Mississippi mud. In the grand halls of Bellemeade Plantation, a desperate whisper would shatter 3 lives forever. Young Mistress Catherine Thornwood stood before a slave with trembling hands and an impossible request, one that defied every law of God and man. What drove a privileged white woman to make such a scandalous proposition? And what price would they all pay when the truth finally surfaced? This is a tale of forbidden desires, dangerous choices, and the cruel realities that bound their fates together in ways none could have imagined. If you enjoy stories of forbidden love, shocking secrets, and historical drama, please subscribe and like my channel. Your support helps me bring more compelling tales to life. Now, let me take you back to 1847, to a world you've never known. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Bellemeade's drawing room, casting delicate shadows across Catherine Thornwood's pale face. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, while Dr. Pritchard delivered words that felt like a death sentence. "Mrs. Thornwood, I must be frank with you," the elderly physician said, his voice heavy with professional sympathy. "After 3 years of marriage and my thorough examinations, I believe the fault lies not with your husband." Catherine's fingers tightened until her knuckles turned white. In 1847 Louisiana, a barren wife was not merely unfortunate, she was a failure. She could already hear the whispers at church socials, see the pitying glances from other plantation wives. Worst of all, she knew what her husband Richard's family expected: an heir to continue the Thornwood legacy. "There must be something," she whispered. "Some treatment, some remedy." Dr. Pritchard shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid medical science has its limits, my dear. Perhaps you might consider prayer, or—" He trailed off delicately. After he departed, Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching the slaves work in the distant cotton fields. Tiny figures moved between endless rows of white bowls, their songs drifting up to the big house like prayers themselves. She had grown up on this plantation, had always accepted the natural order of things without question. Masters and slaves, each in their proper place. But now, desperation made her see the world differently. Her gaze fixed on one figure in particular: Samuel, the educated slave her father had foolishly taught to read before selling him to Richard. Tall and broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see too much. He worked as the overseer's assistant now, trusted with responsibilities most slaves never knew. Richard would be returning from his business in New Orleans in 9 months. 9 months. The number echoed in Catherine's mind like a clock counting down to her ruin. That evening, as she paced her room, a wild idea took root. It was scandalous, sinful, utterly unthinkable. Yet what choice did she have? Divorce would leave her penniless and disgraced. Remaining childless would accomplish the same, only slower. By midnight, Catherine had made her decision. She would do whatever necessary to secure her position, her future, her very survival, even if it meant shattering every rule of the society she'd been born into. 3 days passed before Catherine found the courage to act on her desperate plan. She waited until the overseer, Mr. Caldwell, rode out to inspect the far fields, leaving Samuel alone in the equipment barn. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crossed the yard, a shawl pulled over her distinctive blonde hair. The barn smelled of hay and leather and honest work. Samuel stood with his back to her, organizing tools on the workbench. When her shadow fell across the doorway, he turned, and his eyes widened with alarm. "Mrs. Thornwood," he said quickly, stepping back and lowering his gaze as custom demanded. "You shouldn't be here, ma'am. If someone sees—" "Close the door," Catherine interrupted, her voice trembling despite her attempt at authority. Samuel hesitated, understanding the danger. A white woman alone with a slave in an unclosed space. Even the suggestion of impropriety could end with him hanging from an oak tree. But the desperation in her voice compelled him to obey. He pulled the barn door partially closed, leaving it open enough to avoid scandal. "I need to speak with you about a matter of utmost delicacy," Catherine began, then stopped, the words catching in her throat. How did one propose such a thing? Samuel waited, his expression carefully neutral. At 26, he had learned to hide his thoughts behind a mask of deference. But his mind raced. Nothing good ever came from private conversations with the master's wife. "You can read and write," Catherine said suddenly. "My father taught you before you came here." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied cautiously, wondering where this was leading. Catherine moved closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Then you're intelligent enough to understand what I'm about to say. I need your help, Samuel. I need—" She paused, steadying herself. "I cannot bear children. The doctor has confirmed it. When Mr. Thornwood returns from New Orleans, he will expect to find me with child, or soon to be. My position here, my entire future, depends upon producing an heir." Samuel's stomach tightened as understanding dawned. Surely she couldn't mean, "I need you to give me a baby," Catherine said, the words rushing out now. 9 months. That's all I'm asking. And in return, I promise you'll never spend another night in the slave quarters. You'll have your freedom papers within the year. I'll see to it personally." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel stood frozen, his mind reeling with the impossibility, the danger, the sheer madness of what she proposed. In the South, white men took slave women as they pleased. It was an open secret, a brutal reality. But a white woman and a slave man? That was an unforgivable sin, a crime punishable by the most horrible death imaginable. "Mrs. Thornwood," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "What you're asking. They'd kill me. They'd torture me first, then kill me. And you? No one will ever know," Catherine said fiercely. "I've thought it through. Richard has been gone for 3 months already. When he returns in 6 months, I'll be showing. He'll believe the child is his from before he left. The timing will be believable. And if the baby—" Samuel couldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he meant. If the child bore African features, even slightly, they would all be destroyed. Catherine had considered this, too. She'd studied Samuel carefully these past days. His skin was lighter than most, his features more European due to mixed ancestry somewhere in his bloodline. There was a chance, a terrible, desperate chance, that a child might pass for white. "My grandmother had dark hair and olive skin," Catherine said. "Spanish blood, from her mother's side. People will accept that explanation if needed." Samuel turned away, his hands gripping the workbench. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to run, to forget this conversation ever happened. But another part of him, the part that had dreamed of freedom every night since he was sold away from his mother at age 8, whispered that this might be his only chance. "I need time to think," he said quietly. "You have until tomorrow night," Catherine replied. "Meet me in the rose garden after midnight if your answer is yes. If you don't come, we'll never speak of this again." She left as quietly as she'd arrived, leaving Samuel alone with the most dangerous decision of his life. That night, in the slave quarters, Samuel lay on his narrow cot, while others slept around him. Through the thin walls, he could hear Thomas snoring, could smell the remnants of the evening meal, cornbread and salt pork. This had been his entire existence for 18 years. Back-breaking work, constant fear, the knowledge that he was considered property, less than human in the eyes of the law. But freedom papers. The very thought made his heart race. He could go north, start a new life, perhaps even find his mother again. Yet the risk was unimaginable. One whisper, one suspicious glance, and he'd be dead. As the moon rose high, Samuel made his choice. Part 3. The Dangerous Dance. 400 words. The rose garden at midnight was a cathedral of shadows and moonlight. Catherine stood among the blooms her mother had planted 20 years before, their sweet fragrance doing nothing to calm her racing heart. She had nearly convinced herself he wouldn't come, that sanity had prevailed. Then she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Samuel emerged from the darkness, his face unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across an invisible divide of race, class, and law. Everything that made them impossibly different, dangerously the same. "I'll do it," Samuel said quietly. "But I have conditions." Catherine nodded, hardly daring to breathe. Name them. Freedom papers for Rose, too. She's my sister. Same mother, different fathers. She works in the laundry house. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. And I want them before the baby comes, not after. Once you have what you need, there's nothing to stop you from forgetting your promises. Catherine flinched at the implication, though she knew it was justified. How many times had she witnessed slaves promise freedom, only to see those promises broken? Agreed. But the papers will be dated for after the birth. We cannot risk anyone questioning why two slaves suddenly received freedom. And one more thing, Samuel continued, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time, a boldness that could get him whipped. If this child is born, and you can't hide what it is, you get us away before they come for me. You owe me that much. You have my word, Catherine whispered. Over the following weeks, they met 3 times in the rose garden, their encounters brief and businesslike, driven by necessity rather than desire. Catherine had expected to feel shame, disgust even. Instead, she felt strangely numb, as if watching someone else commit these sins. Samuel spoke little during their meetings, his face carefully blank. But afterward, alone in the quarters, he would shake with fear and self-loathing. What kind of man was he to participate in this? Yet what choice did he have? A slave had no real choice in anything. By the 4th week, Catherine's courses had stopped. She confided in no one except her lady's maid, Bessie, an older slave who had served Catherine since childhood. Bessie's reaction was a mix of horror and pragmatic acceptance. Lord have mercy, Miss Catherine, Bessie breathed, her dark eyes wide. What you done if Master Richard finds out? He won't, Catherine said firmly, though her insides churned with fear. No one will. You're the only one who knows, and I trust you'll keep my secret. Bessie nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. That's Samuel. He's a good man. Too good for this world, I sometimes think. You be careful with him, Miss Catherine. He ain't just a tool for your using. The words stung because they were true. Catherine had tried not to think of Samuel as a person, as someone with hopes and fears of his own. It was easier to see him as merely a means to an end. But 2 months into her pregnancy, everything changed. Catherine was descending the main staircase when she felt dizzy. She grabbed the banister, missed, and tumbled down 6 steps before Bessie caught her. In the chaos that followed, Dr. Pritchard summoned. Catherine confined to bed. No one noticed the figure watching from the hallway. Clara Thornwood, Richard's younger sister, had arrived unexpectedly from Charleston. At 19, she was sharp-eyed and suspicious, always searching for scandal to elevate her own position in society. She had seen Catherine's fall, had noticed something peculiar about the way Bessie and Samuel exchanged glances when the doctor announced the pregnancy. That evening, Clara began watching. She noted how Bessie brought special meals to the quarters, something unusual for a lady's maid. She observed Samuel's haunted expression whenever Catherine's name was mentioned, and she waited, patient as a spider, for proof of what she suspected. 3 weeks later, Clara found it. She had followed Bessie to the old storage cabin behind the laundry house, where the slave woman delivered a basket of food. Through a crack in the door, Clara watched Bessie speak to Samuel in hushed tones. Miss Catherine says you need to be more careful. People are starting to notice how nervous you've been acting. Clara's smile was cruel and triumphant. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but she had enough to know something was deeply wrong. And when her brother returned from New Orleans, she would make sure he learned the truth. The trap was set. The clock was ticking, and none of them knew that the most shocking revelation was still to come. Richard Thornwood returned to Bellemeade on a humid September afternoon, 6 months after his departure. Catherine stood on the front portico in a loose-fitting dress that concealed her condition, her smile bright and practiced. Behind her forced cheerfulness lay a terror so profound she could barely breathe. "My darling," Richard said, embracing her carefully. At 35, he was a handsome man with graying temples and the confident bearing of inherited wealth. "You look radiant. Has something changed?" "I have news, husband," Catherine said, her voice trembling with what he would interpret as joy. "I'm with child. 4 months along." The doctor confirms it. Richard's face transformed with genuine delight. He swept her into his arms, laughing. This is wonderful. My father will be overjoyed. An heir at last. Watching from an upstairs window, Clara's eyes narrowed. 4 months. But Richard had been gone for 6. She had expected Catherine to claim 2 or 3 months at most. Unless. That evening at dinner, Clara began her careful interrogation. Sister, how wonderful about the baby. You must have conceived right before Richard left? Yes, Catherine said quickly. Just before. How fortunate, Clara continued, her voice honey-sweet. Though I confess, I'm surprised. You told me yourself last Christmas that you and Richard had been having difficulties, that the doctor said you might never conceive. The room went silent. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What's this, Catherine? Clara misunderstood, Catherine said, shooting her sister-in-law a warning glance. I said we'd been trying for some time, nothing more. But Clara had tasted blood. Perhaps I did misunderstand. Just as I may have misunderstood what I saw last week, Bessie taking special meals to the quarters. To Samuel specifically, your father's educated slave. Such unusual attention for a field worker's assistant. Bessie takes meals to many of the workers, Catherine said, but her voice wavered. Richard's expression had shifted from confusion to suspicion. He was not a stupid man, merely one who had trusted his wife completely. Now, seeds of doubt took root. That night, Richard summoned Bessie to his study. The old woman stood before him, trembling but dignified. Richard paced like a caged animal, his earlier joy curdling into something dark. I want the truth, Bessie. You've served this family for 30 years. You've earned my respect. But if you lie to me now, I'll have you sold south to the sugar plantations before sunrise. Bessie's resolve crumbled. She was 60 years old, had survived by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. But the sugar plantations were a death sentence, brutal work that killed slaves within years. She had grandchildren in the quarters. She couldn't abandon them. Master Richard, she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. Miss Catherine, she was desperate. The doctor told her she was barren. She was going to lose everything. Tell me everything, Richard commanded, his voice like ice. And Bessie did. When she finished, Richard stood frozen, his face ashen. The magnitude of the betrayal, the scandal, the sheer impossibility of what his wife had done, it was beyond comprehension. A white woman and a slave. His wife and his property. The child she carried. Get out, he said quietly. Send Samuel to me. No! Bessie fled, her heart breaking. She found Samuel in the quarters and delivered the message with shaking hands. He knows, she sobbed. Lord forgive me, he knows everything. Samuel felt his world collapse. He had always known this moment might come, but the reality was far worse than imagination. He could run, should run, but where would he go? Slave patrols would hunt him down within days. And Rose, his sister. If he ran, Richard would take his vengeance on her instead. I have to face him, Samuel said quietly. He'll kill you, Bessie cried. You know what they do too. I know, Samuel interrupted. But if I run, Rose dies. You all might die. This is my doing. I'll face the consequences. He walked to the big house like a man approaching the gallows. In the study, Richard waited with a loaded pistol on his desk. Sit, Richard commanded. Samuel remained standing. If he was going to die, he would die on his feet. Did my wife force you? Richard asked, his voice barely controlled. No, sir, Samuel said honestly. She offered me freedom. I accepted. Freedom, Richard laughed bitterly. And what did you think would happen when the baby was born? Did you imagine you'd just walk away while my name was attached to your? He couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Richard stood, picked up the pistol, and for a long moment simply stared at the man before him. Samuel met his gaze steadily, waiting for the bullet. But it didn't come. Instead, Richard set down the gun and walked to the window. Get out of my sight, he said hoarsely. Go to the quarters. Don't speak to anyone. I need to think. Samuel left quickly, hardly believing he was still alive. But he knew this was merely a reprieve, not a pardon. Upstairs, Catherine had heard everything through the floorboards. She sat on her bed, one hand on her swelling belly, and wept. For 3 days, Richard did not speak to his wife. He took his meals in his study, slept in the guest room, and avoided Catherine as if she carried the plague. The entire household felt the tension. Slaves whispered in corners. Clara smiled with barely concealed satisfaction, and Catherine wandered the halls like a ghost. On the fourth morning, Richard summoned Catherine to his study. She entered to find him seated behind his father's mahogany desk, looking 10 years older than when he'd arrived home. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. A half-empty whiskey bottle sat at his elbow. "Sit down, Catherine," he said wearily. She obeyed, her hands folded protectively over her belly. The baby had begun to move recently, small flutters that reminded her this was no longer just about her survival. Another life hung in the balance. "I should kill him," Richard said without preamble. "Samuel. I should have him hanged in front of the entire county as an example. That's what the law demands. What society demands." Catherine's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "And what would that accomplish, Richard? Revenge? Satisfaction? It wouldn't change what's done." "No," he agreed bitterly. "Nothing can change that. You've made me a cuckold, Catherine. Do you understand what that means? If word of this spreads, I'll be ruined. My business associates will abandon me. My family name will become a joke. And this child," he gestured at her belly with disgust, "this abomination you carry will be living proof of your betrayal." "Then what do you propose?" Catherine asked quietly. Richard leaned back, studying her with cold calculation. "I've spent these 3 days considering my options. I could divorce you, expose everything, send you away in disgrace. I could have Samuel killed and sell every slave on this plantation to erase all witnesses." He paused, taking a long drink. "I could find a way to salvage something from this disaster." Catherine waited, hardly daring to hope. "Clara suspects, but she doesn't have proof," Richard continued. "Bessie won't talk if she values her life. Samuel certainly won't. That leaves you and me. We're the only ones who can confirm the truth." "What are you saying?" Catherine whispered. "I'm saying we continue the lie," Richard said flatly. "To everyone, including Clara, this child is mine. You will play the devoted wife. I will play the proud father. And no one will ever know the truth." "And Samuel?" Catherine asked, her heart pounding. Richard's jaw tightened. "Samuel will be sold tomorrow to a plantation in Texas, far enough away that he'll never return. I won't have him here as a constant reminder of what you did." "No!" Catherine stood abruptly. "Richard, I promised him freedom. He only agreed because you tempted him with something no slave can resist," Richard interrupted coldly. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? He touched a white woman, Catherine, my wife. In any other circumstance, he'd be tortured and burned alive. I'm being merciful by simply selling him." "Mercy?" Catherine's voice broke. "You call separating him from his sister mercy? Rose is all he has in this world." "Then he should have thought of that before he bedded my wife," Richard roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The sound echoed through the study like a gunshot. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice cold and controlled. "This is my offer, Catherine. We maintain appearances, raise this child as a Thornwood, and Samuel disappears from our lives forever. Or I expose everything, divorce you, and watch as Samuel hangs from the nearest tree while you're cast out with nothing but the clothes on your back. Choose." Catherine sank back into her chair, defeated. She had gambled everything and lost. There was no choice, really. There never had been. "I agree to your terms," she whispered. "Good," Richard said. "I've already contacted a slave trader. He'll collect Samuel at dawn. You will not speak to him. You will not say goodbye. As far as this household is concerned, Samuel is being sold for insubordination. Nothing more." That night, Catherine lay in her bed, tears soaking her pillow. She had doomed Samuel to save herself and the child. The weight of that guilt would crush her for the rest of her life. But in the quarters, a different plan was taking shape. Rose had learned of her brother's impending sale from Bessie. The news broke something inside her, the last thread of hope that had kept her surviving each brutal day. Her brother, who had protected her since childhood, who had taught her the few words of reading he knew, who had promised they would find freedom together someday. She found Samuel sitting alone behind the quarters, staring at the stars. "I won't let them take you," Rose said fiercely, sitting beside him. "You don't have a choice, Rose," Samuel replied gently. "None of us do." "Then I'm coming with you," she declared. "I'll run away, follow the trader's wagon, find you in Texas." "No," Samuel gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me. You stay here. Keep your head down. Survive. And when that baby is born," he paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, "when that baby is born, you watch over it. That child is your blood too, your niece or nephew. Don't let them turn it into what they tried to make us." Rose sobbed against his chest, and Samuel held his sister for what might be the last time, memorizing the feeling of family, of love, of belonging to someone. Dawn came too quickly. The slave trader's wagon rolled away from Bellemeade as the sun crested the horizon, carrying Samuel toward an uncertain fate in Texas. Catherine watched from her bedroom window, one hand pressed against the glass, the other on her belly. She had not slept. She had not prayed. She had only waited for this moment, knowing it would haunt her forever. 5 months later, on a cold February morning in 1848, Catherine gave birth to a daughter. Dr. Pritchard placed the squalling infant in her arms, and Catherine's breath caught. The baby had Richard's pale skin, Catherine's delicate features, but her hair, though fine and soft, held a subtle curl that made Catherine's heart stop. The child's eyes, still the cloudy blue of all newborns, might darken with time or might not. "A beautiful girl," the doctor proclaimed. "Small, but healthy. Congratulations, Mrs. Thornwood." Richard entered the room after the doctor departed. He stared at the baby for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "We'll call her Margaret, after my mother." "Margaret," Catherine repeated softly, studying the tiny face. "Hello, little Margaret." Over the following weeks, the household settled into an uneasy rhythm. Richard treated Margaret with cool politeness, acknowledging her as his heir, but never showing the warmth a father should. Clara, still suspicious but lacking proof, eventually returned to Charleston, disappointed that no scandal had materialized. But Rose watched. From the laundry house, from the gardens, from every corner where slaves became invisible, Rose watched the child who carried her brother's blood. She saw how Catherine held the baby with a mixture of love and guilt. She saw how Richard could barely look at his supposed daughter. And she made a decision that would change everything. On Margaret's first birthday, Rose requested an audience with Catherine. It was unusual. Slaves did not request meetings with the mistress, but Catherine agreed, curiosity overcoming caution. They met in the rose garden where it had all begun. "Miss Catherine," Rose said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "I need to tell you something about my brother. Something he made me promise to keep secret, but I think you need to know." Catherine's heart raced. "What is it?" "Samuel, he knew the risk he was taking when he agreed to help you. But there's something you didn't know about him." Rose paused, gathering courage. "Our father wasn't a slave. He was a white overseer from Virginia. That's why Samuel's skin was lighter, why his features were the way they were. Our mother told us before she died. She said we should never speak of it, that it would only bring trouble." Catherine's mind reeled. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because that baby girl in there, she's not just part Samuel. She's part white on both sides, more than you even knew. She'll grow up never knowing half of who she is, thinking she's purely a Thornwood. But she's also part of my family. And Samuel, wherever he is, he deserves to know he has a daughter who will live free." Tears streamed down Catherine's face. "I destroyed your brother's life for my own selfish needs, Rose. How can you even speak to me?" "Because Samuel told me something before they took him," Rose replied. "He said if he had to make the choice again, knowing how it would end, he would still do it. Because even one moment of choosing his own path, of having agency over his own life, even if that choice led to suffering, was worth more than a lifetime of having no choice at all. The words broke something in Catherine. She had spent a year telling herself she was the victim, trapped by circumstance and society's expectations. But Samuel and Rose had never had even the luxury of self-pity. They had survived, adapted, and somehow maintained their dignity in a world designed to strip it away. "What can I do?" Catherine whispered. "How can I possibly make this right?" Rose looked toward the big house where Margaret slept. "Teach her kindness. Teach her that the accident of birth doesn't make one person better than another. And when she's old enough to understand, tell her the truth. All of it. Don't let her grow up believing the lies we had to tell to survive. Richard would never allow." "Richard won't live forever," Rose interrupted quietly. "Men like him, they carry anger like poison in their blood. It'll consume him eventually. But you and that baby, you have time. You can make different choices than the ones that brought us to this place." 3 years passed. True to Rose's prediction, Richard's health declined, whether from the whiskey he consumed nightly or the bitterness that ate at his soul, no one could say. He died in his study one winter evening, leaving Catherine a widow at 28. With Richard gone, Catherine found herself free in ways she had never imagined. She began making small changes at Bellemeade: better food for the slaves, shorter work hours, a schoolroom where Rose taught children their letters in secret. She could not free them all without financial ruin, but she could make their lives more bearable. Margaret grew into a bright, curious child who played with the slave children without understanding why such friendships troubled the neighboring plantation owners. She had her mother's blonde hair, the curls had relaxed as she aged, and her father's gray eyes. Only those who looked very closely might notice the subtle differences: the slight bronzing of her skin in summer, the particular shape of her nose. On Margaret's 7th birthday, Catherine took her daughter to the rose garden. "There's a story I need to tell you," Catherine began, her voice trembling, "about where you really came from, and about a very brave man who gave you life." As the sun set over Bellemeade, Catherine told her daughter the truth, all of it. The desperation, the bargain, the sacrifice. Margaret listened with wide eyes, too young to fully comprehend but old enough to understand that her mother was entrusting her with something precious and dangerous. "Will I ever meet him?" Margaret asked. "My real father?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Catherine admitted. "But I promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to find him, to let him know that you exist and that you're loved." It took 4 more years, countless letters, and the help of abolitionists who worked in secret. But eventually Catherine received word. Samuel was alive, working on a ranch in Texas under a relatively humane owner. He had married, had 2 more children, and dreamed every night of the family he'd left behind. Catherine wrote him a letter, the most important of her life. She unclosed a daguerreotype of Margaret and sent it through underground channels. The response came 6 months later, a single page, written in Samuel's careful hand. "Thank you for letting me know she lives and thrives. Tell her that her father thinks of her every day, that he is proud she will grow up free from the chains that bound him. Tell her to be brave, to be kind, and to remember that the truest measure of a person is not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And tell her that love, real love, is stronger than any law or custom men might create to divide us." Catherine kept that letter in a locked box, reading it to Margaret every year on her birthday. As Margaret grew into a young woman, she understood more fully the complexity of her origins, the privilege she inherited, the sacrifice that had made it possible, and the responsibility she carried to honor both sides of her heritage. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, Margaret was 18 years old. She turned Bellemeade into a station on the Underground Railroad, using her position and her inherited wealth to help slaves escape to freedom. Rose worked alongside her, the 2 women united by bonds deeper than anyone outside their small circle could understand. And in Texas, Samuel lived to see emancipation. He never returned to Louisiana. The memories were too painful, the risks still too great. But he died in 1867 knowing that his daughter lived free, that his sacrifice had meant something, and that somewhere in the world, people were beginning to understand that the color of one's skin did not determine the content of one's soul. Catherine passed away in 1869, 2 years after Samuel. On her deathbed, she held Margaret's hand and whispered, "I made terrible choices, committed terrible sins. But if those sins brought you into this world, then perhaps God can forgive me. Can you?" Margaret kissed her mother's forehead. "There's nothing to forgive, Mama. You did what you had to survive, and you spent the rest of your life trying to make it right. That's all any of us can do." The story of Catherine, Samuel, and the child born between two worlds became a whispered legend in Louisiana, the details morphing and changing with each telling. Some versions painted Catherine as a villain, others as a victim. Some remembered Samuel as a cautionary tale, others as a hero. But the truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. They were all victims of a system that dehumanized some while corrupting others. They were all survivors who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. And they were all connected by a child who carried within her the possibility of redemption, the hope that future generations might build a world where such choices would never be necessary again. Margaret lived until 1912, long enough to see her own grandchildren grow up in a changed America. She never forgot the story her mother told her in the rose garden, never forgot the father she never knew but always carried in her heart. And she passed that story down through generations, a reminder that history is not made only by the powerful and privileged, but by the countless unknown people whose courage and sacrifice shaped the world in ways large and small. The rose garden at Bellemeade still blooms every summer, though the plantation house has long since fallen to ruin. But on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of whispered promises, dangerous bargains, and the enduring truth that love, in all its complicated, painful, transcendent forms, can never be completely bound by the laws of man.